All right, so get ready. We're going deep, really deep into the case of William Bonin, the Freeway killer.
That's right, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history.
Definitely. And to really get into it, we've got some pretty intense material to work with. We've got excerpts from, let me get this right, William Bonin, the Freeway killer.
A classic true crime text.
For sure. And of course, we couldn't do a deep dive without his Wikipedia page.
Which I have to say is surprisingly extensive. You really did your research for this one.
Had to. This one is, well, it's dark, but I think what we really want to try and understand here is, I mean, yeah, the crimes are horrible, but we want to get into the why. Like, how does someone become, a monster like this?
Exactly. It's about going beyond the surface, beyond the headlines, and really trying to understand the psychology, the motivations, the factors that led him down this path.
Right. So let's start at the beginning. Bonin's childhood. I mean, wow, just who was rough, like really rough. Alcoholic father, gambler, we're talking serious dysfunction.
And it gets worse. There's evidence that he was molested by his grandfather. Can you imagine the impact of that kind of abuse, especially at such a young age?
And then to make things even more complicated, he ends up in this like super strict Catholic orphanage in the 50s.
We're talking about an environment where discipline often bordered on, well, on cruelty.
Yeah. It's hard to even imagine. I mean, honestly, this is starting to feel like a textbook case of, like what they call it, the cycle of abuse.
It's a classic example, unfortunately. When a child is repeatedly exposed to violence, to neglect, to trauma, it can really distort their view of the world, their understanding of relationships.
So basically, they learn that this messed up way of being, it's normal.
Exactly. They might even start to believe that these behaviors are necessary for survival, to protect themselves.
That's scary, and it's sad too, but okay. There's this one detail that really got to me. Apparently, Bonin's mother viewed him as, and this is a quote, worthless. What? I mean, what does that even do to a kid to hear that from your own mother?
Oh, that's a huge red flag. It goes way beyond just the lack of love.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about secure attachment in psychology and how crucial that is for a child's development.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Right. So if a child doesn't have that secure base, that sense of being loved and valued just for who they are, well, it can really mess with their sense of self-worth, their ability to form healthy relationships, their whole view of themselves.
Like their foundation is it's broken from the start.
Exactly. It's like trying to build a house on sand. It's just not going to be stable.
Wow. Okay, so we're seeing this like seriously unstable foundation in Bonin's early life, right? Trauma, neglect, abuse. But then, and this is where it gets weird, he joins the Air Force.
Yeah, the Air Force. And not only that, he serves in Vietnam as an aerial gunner, no less. He even received a medal for bravery.
It's almost hard to believe, right? I mean, this is the same guy who, later becomes a serial killer. Doesn't quite fit the profile.
It's a perfect example of how complex human behavior can be. I mean, we tend to think in these black and white terms, right? Good or evil. But people are they're so much more complicated than that.
For sure. So how do you make sense of that then? Like, how can someone be capable of both heroism and such, just awful acts?
Well, for one thing, we have to remember that trauma doesn't just magically disappear. It stays with you. It shapes you, even if you try to bury it.
Right.
And then you add the stress of war, the constant exposure to violence. It can be a volatile combination. For some people, that kind of extreme experience might trigger almost like a protective shell, a way to compartmentalize, to cope. But for others, it can crack open those vulnerabilities, those pre-existing wounds.
So for Bonin, it was like the war made things worse.
It's possible.
Yeah.
We also have to consider that even during his service, there were signs, red flags. He actually confessed to sexually assaulting 2 soldiers under his command.
At gunpoint.
Yeah. It's a chilling reminder that the seeds of predatory violence were already there, even if they hadn't fully blossomed yet.
So it's like this darkness, this potential for violence was always lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. And when Bonin returned to civilian life, things took a very dark turn. That's when the real escalation began.
He starts molesting young boys, and his MO is, well, it's disturbingly specific. He targets hitchhikers, often offering them money for sex.
That pattern, it's incredibly revealing. It suggests this need for power and control, a way to assert dominance over vulnerable individuals. And the money, it's not about a genuine exchange. It's about coercion.
Dehumanizing them.
Exactly. Stripping them of their agency.
It's awful.
Yeah.
But at least, thank goodness, he eventually gets arrested for these crimes. He ends up at Atascadero State Hospital, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Atascadero. He's diagnosed as a sexual psychopath and deemed highly likely to reoffend. You would think that would be enough to keep him off the streets, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point, right? To protect the public.
You would think so. And that's where it gets really, really troubling.
Because they let him out.
Yeah. After receiving treatment, supposedly making progress, they released him.
So did the system fail?
It's a question a lot of people ask. And it's not an easy one to answer. We have to remember that our understanding of these kinds of disorders and how to treat them was much more limited back then. But still, the consequences of that release were devastating.
And right before Atascadero, he tells the police, next time, there won't be any more witnesses. I mean, just chills.
It's bone-chilling. That statement shows a level of premeditation, a detachment from the consequences of his actions, that it's just terrifying. It's clear he was already thinking about escalating, about eliminating any risk.
And escalate he did. Which brings us to the emergence of the Freeway killer. But we'll get into that in part 2.
So Bonin's release from Atascadero, I mean, it really was a turning point, a terrifying one. This is when he fully becomes a freeway killer, right? Brutally murdering young men and boys all along the Southern California highways.
Yeah. It's hard to even wrap your head around the level of brutality we're talking about here. I mean, he wasn't just killing them. He was torturing them, mutilating them.
Right. It was pure sadism. And, you know, that's something we see with a lot of serial killers, this kind of escalation of violence.
Escalation.
Yeah, like it's as if they need to push the boundaries further and further, you know, to get the same level of, I guess, gratification. Their sense of morality, empathy, it's gone. Completely eroded.
Like a dark addiction almost.
Exactly. And there's this detail that always gets me. He kept a scrapbook.
A scrapbook?
Yeah. Full of newspaper clippings about his own murders. Like, he needed that recognition to see his crimes reflected back at him.
Wow. That's messed up.
It is. It speaks to, I think, a deep-seated narcissism, this complete lack of remorse. And, you know, it wasn't just Bonin himself.
Right, the accomplices, the people who helped him carry out these murders.
Right, and I think we need to talk about Vernon Butts.
Yeah.
I mean, he was Bonin's lover,
right,
but also a frequent accomplice.
Their relationship, it's hard to understand, like, how does someone get drawn into that kind of darkness?
Well, the relationship between Bonin and Butts, it's actually pretty fascinating, psychologically, I mean. There's this concept, it's called folie à deux.
Folie à deux.
Yeah, it basically means madness of two. It's this shared psychosis, right, where one person's, like, delusional beliefs are transmitted to another.
So they were feeding off each other's darkness.
In a way, yeah. I mean, Butts was clearly troubled, easily influenced. But Bonin, he was the dominant personality. He had this vision, you know, this twisted plan, and he pulled Butts into it.
It's like something out of a nightmare.
And remember those mystery parties that Butts organized where people would search for murder weapons?
Wait, what? Seriously?
Yeah. I mean, it's more than just disturbing, right? It's a glimpse into their shared delusion. This world they created where violence, death, it all became a form of, like, twisted entertainment.
God. And there were other accomplices too, right?
Right. Gregory Miley, James Monroe, William Pugh.
All part of this horrifying web.
It's really unsettling, isn't it? Like, what makes someone susceptible to this kind of influence? What drives a person to become complicit in these acts?
And it's especially baffling, you know, knowing that Bonin had already been caught, diagnosed, he was in prison. How was he allowed back on the streets to commit these horrific crimes?
Well, there were definitely some missteps. I mean, systemic failures for sure. Like, Bonin actually violated his parole, right?
He should have been sent back to prison.
Exactly. But because of an administrative error, they let him go. It's a stark reminder that even with the best intentions, systems can fail.
Yeah.
And the consequences, well, they can be devastating.
Yeah. It's almost unbelievable. And during that time, his crimes they kept going, claiming more innocent lives.
Each victim, each story just adds to the tragedy. I mean, we have to remember, these weren't just statistics, right? They're individuals with families, with their own hopes and dreams.
It's heartbreaking. And I know it's tough, but we have to talk about the details of his capture. I mean, he was finally arrested.
Right.
With James
They
Monroe.
were in Bonin's van.
And what the police found, it must have been shocking.
It was. bloodstains, restraining devices, that scrapbook we talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a chilling testament to the meticulousness of his crimes. He planned, he documented, he almost reveled in it.
Like he thought he was untouchable.
It's possible, but he wasn't. Once he's in custody, he confesses to 21 murders.
21. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
I know. And his trials, they became this huge media spectacle, all those gruesome details. It captivated the public. And during the trials, I think a crucial question emerged, was Bonin a product of his environment, warped by all that childhood trauma, or was he just evil?
Nature versus nurture.
Right. It's a question that still haunts this case. I mean, his defense attorneys, they tried to portray him as a victim, right? Driven to violence by these forces outside his control. But the prosecution, they argued he was a cold, calculating predator.
So what's the truth? I mean, is it ever that simple?
It's so complex, and I don't think there are any easy answers. But the court, they ultimately sided with the prosecution. Bonin was convicted, sentenced to death.
Executed in 1996, the first prisoner in California to die by lethal injection. It must have been, some kind of closure for the families of his victims.
I'm sure it was.
Yeah.
But it also, it reignited this debate.
Yep.
About capital punishment, about the ethics of taking a life, even a life like Bonin's.
Yeah, heavy stuff. But there are other questions that linger too, right? Like, what can we learn from all of this? How do we prevent these kinds of tragedies in the future?
Exactly, and that's what we'll explore in part 3.
Man, it's heavy. We've talked about so much, the crimes, the psychology, all the things that went wrong. But I gotta say, what really stays with me, it's the victims. And their families.
Absolutely. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the details of the case, right? The psychology of the killer. But we can't forget the human cost.
Their lives were just shattered. Their sense of safety, of trust, it's gone.
Yeah. And it goes beyond just those directly harmed. Bonin's actions, they had this ripple effect that spread throughout the community.
And there's this other layer to all this, something that, I don't know, it makes this whole thing even more tragic. I mean, Bonin's crimes, they happened during a time when, well, there was a lot of prejudice against the gay community.
You're right. And his victims, they were almost all young men and boys. They were caught in the crosshairs of that hatred.
It's like they were victimized twice, first by Bonin and then by the prejudice and fear that surrounded their very identities.
Exactly. Their deaths, they became fuel for those harmful stereotypes. It's awful.
Makes you wonder, would things have been different if Bonin's victims hadn't been gay? Would there have been more empathy, more outrage? I don't know, it's a hard question, but it's one we need to ask.
I think it's a question of how societal biases can shape our understanding of events. They can distort how we see victims, how we see perpetrators. It's something we have to be really aware of.
So, okay, shifting gears a little bit. What can we learn from this case? In terms of prevention, could things have been done differently?
Well, we talked about the systemic failures.
Yeah.
Those missed opportunities to intervene. I think there's a lot to learn there about how we assess risk, how we treat offenders, how we protect the most vulnerable.
And what about Bonin's childhood, all that trauma? If there had been early intervention, support for his family, I don't know, could that have made a difference?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's impossible to know for sure. But I think this case really highlights the importance of early childhood development, the need for mental health resources, and just the vital role of a supportive community in preventing violence.
These problems, they don't just exist in a vacuum, right? They're connected to all these larger social and economic issues.
Exactly. It's about addressing the root causes, creating a culture of empathy, understanding that we all have a role to play in building a safer world.
So we've gone deep into this really dark chapter, explored the mind of a killer, talked about some really tough stuff. What's the takeaway for you, for our listeners?
For me, I think it's the importance of understanding all the things that contribute to violence, the impact it has on people, and just, even in the darkest cases, there are lessons to be learned, insights that can help us move forward.
Maybe even find some hope, right? If we shine a light on these issues, have these tough conversations, maybe, just maybe, we can prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening.
I believe so. It's about turning knowledge into action, using what we've learned to create real change.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said. And on that note, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Bonin's case, it had a huge impact, especially on the gay community of Southern California. It It created this climate of fear, reinforced all these negative stereotypes, made people suspicious, distrustful. And it's a reminder that that fear can be exploited, that prejudice can be used to divide us. So how do we combat that? How do we create a world where everyone feels safe, seen, respected, no matter who they are, no matter who they love? It's something to think about, to talk about, and most importantly, to act on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.